Karl Marx was a German Jew born right after Napoleon had brought French democracy to Europe. And Marx left his family behind in the German countryside, so he struggled to fit in with the culture of the big city of Berlin. And Marx became a fish out of water and started writing about his personal bad experiences with the world in general and economic matters in particular. Marx wrote enough books to fill many wheelbarrows, and people enjoyed reading them because they were very interesting and easy to read, instead of most of the books written at the time that were lofty treatises about esoteric opinions that were difficult to read, appealing only to a privileged few. But Marx came up with writing that was popular with the common man. The old world order was struggling to maintain its legitimacy while science and technology were on the ascendant, and foremost among the people trying to bring down the old world order were Jews, sick of Christians lambasting them for having killed Jesus Christ. Jews in Russia had learned to read and write in their own Hebrew schools, and the Red Soviets gave them the job of going out to collectivize the peasant villages, since that required reading and writing skills, and the peasants welcomed the Jewish commissars who worked tirelessly to improve the lives of the villagers. Over 2/3 of the Bolshevik leaders in the Russian Revolution had been Jewish, and there were two kinds of these Jews: the Stalinist Jews, willing to cooperate with the state until the Messiah returned, and the globalist Trotskyite Jews, who believed that God ordered them to prepare the world for the coming of Messiah by infiltrating and controlling all government on the planet, because Messiah would not appear, in their understanding, until the world had a Jewish government in place ready to welcome him. The nobility of Europe were largely Christian and had excluded Jews from all walks of life for not being sorry they had killed Christ, so unseating the nobility in Europe by means of communist revolution had become the fervent battle cry of the revolutionary Jews. Many Jews liked the idea of communism because they hoped that if everyone were forced to be equal, the Jew-hating would stop if discriminating against them were made illegal, and that meant knocking the nobility off their thrones, and the revolutionaries swore that until the communists seized power, the world would know neither peace nor civility. The first penny press emerged in Europe in 1830 with the new high-speed rotary printing presses and cheap pulp paper, and newspapers flooded over Europe full of political rhetoric and salacious stories about the revolutionaries, and they were called newspapers, but when there were no news, the editors of the papers would make something up. Those still on fire for the French Revolution continued to agitate with their protests and rebellions, and these agitators made the nobility more determined to keep the doors of their estates closed to the revolutionaries who were making headlines in the newspapers. The friction match had been invented in 1827 by an Englishman named John Walker, so now people were able to use the newspapers to easily start their home fires, and by the year of revolutions, in 1848, it had become a daily routine to read the newspaper every day, hot off the press, and they were especially read in Germany because the good German schools had taught the Germans to read. These cheap newspapers brewed up the year of revolutions in 1848 that basically put an end to feudalism in Europe, while the American South hung on to theirs where it was against the law in the South to teach slaves to read. The European universities had been letting more commoners in on scholarships, and these commoners were untrained in the ways of the nobility, the grace of the aristocracy in the face of human limitations, the forgiveness of human error, the creation of place and purpose for the infirm, the continuity of history, and the humility of inborn privilege, enforced through the inevitable transgression serving as a bad example and a warning, and those gentle manners went lacking in the new student body, who were unprepared to find a place in the world upon graduation other than marching down the streets, waving red flags. The revolutionaries were incapable of engaging in the free-ranging discourse the nobility practiced as a form of entertainment, so they were especially not invited to the dinner tables of their betters, and they used language that was thick with slander and full of bullying, intended merely to defeat a misperceived enemy, and the shame of it was that the revolutionaries did this violence in the name of the working man. In order to gain power and safety for themselves, the revolutionaries' best idea was to steal it from the nobility, to tear down and exterminate anyone who owned land or factories or any kind of business enterprise, and when the smoke cleared, there would be no supplies to keep the estates running, and even less goodwill to help those in need, because now the state was expected to provide those services that had been the responsibility of the nobility before all the revolutionary talk infected Europe. Russia had survived the year of revolutions in 1848 because there were more peasants in Russia than the disgruntled working class marching in the streets of Europe, and the year of revolutions in 1848 was about the intelligentsia needing to earn wages at jobs because they no longer had a place in the old world economy of the nobility after Napoleon's armies had toppled thrones across Europe and upended the nobility, and the Congress of Vienna in 1814 tried to bring back the old regime, but it had been smeared too thoroughly to return to the way things had been. The idea of communism had first been born in France nearly 800 years before, when the French king Louis the Fat had allowed cities to pay him money in 1108 in exchange for being allowed to govern themselves, and these cities had been called communes, while the rest of France was suffering the oppressive demands of the local fortified castles, regularly sending out armed squads demanding that the country folks supply whatever was needed at the local castle. This arrangement made the French peasants no better than slaves, and the nearby castles were occupied more often than not by French nobility of mostly German descent. So the French peasants had turned to the Pope in Rome for protection, because the Pope's money could influence the local government to be less harsh on the poor French people. When the first crusade had been announced at Clermont in Auvergne in 1095, the French peasants eagerly signed up for an opportunity to get away from the local castled kingpins, and for centuries thereafter Louis the Fat's French communists worked their land, happily singing Catholic songs and prospering under their self-government, except when interrupted by invasions from the King of England, trying to make himself also the King of France. Marx wanted to see business freed from the whim of the nobility, and he described materialism as the down-to-earth needs for humans to survive, and in spite of his accusers, Marx did not say there was no God, but wrote about what life was like without him. Political emancipation from religion permits religion, though not privileged religion, to continue. The fulfillment of the Christian state is a state that acknowledges itself as a state and ignores the religion of its members. The emancipation of the state from religion is not the emancipation of actual man from religion. Writings of the young Marx on philosophy and society, translated and edited by Lloyd D. Easton and Kurt H. Goudat, Anchor Books, Doubleday and Company, Inc., 1967, page 232. Marx wrote that a state acts more like a church than a state when they insist their workers be good people rather than good workers, and people loved reading Marx because it was very readable. Marx's notion of the proletariat worker did not mean just workers in general, but a worker not able to work because the changing industrial economy had eliminated the usual manner of employment, and thus there was no work to be had. The new proletariat worker was neither a peasant nor a slave, not a merchant or a banker or any of the trades that fit into the ordinary work done for centuries in Europe, but the proletariat was unable to survive in a new industrialized world, and Marx was speaking from his own experience of having moved away from his Jewish roots into the big city of Berlin. Marx wrote about a worker left behind, not because of capitalism itself, but because the capitalist of his day had become accustomed to an economy run by the state, or more specifically by the nobility, and now business was booming faster than the old world order could keep up. To Marx, the industrial worker was a new man, a person who used wrenches and coal and iron and steam to construct technological miracles for the masses, and he was a worker who had become alienated from the traditional structure of the old village. This industrial proletariat worker was someone not doing the work once needed to support the nobility, or doing the chores needed to run a farm, but Marx's proletariat was a new kind of industrial worker, not the servants or the police, not the tax collectors or the wagon masters, not the woodcutters or water haulers, and not the farmers, butchers, tailors, or the guy who crafted Fabergé eggs. Marx's German word for proletariat had been improperly translated as exploitation of the worker, without the connotation of its being an industrial worker, while the Russian translation sounded even more sinister than having the meaning of being a condition or an environment in the sense of there being a climate, and the communists badly wanted a climate change. Marx's understanding of proletariat did not intend a class of people and did not emphasize a difference in class, but meant an individual person who had suffered from some newfangled economic wrong and no longer fit into the social structure, and Marx emphasized that the proletarian victim suffered through no fault of his own, and Marx had truly been speaking for himself. Educated Germans enjoying the prosperity of the Industrial Revolution especially loved talking about Marx, and many of them were women whose ideological chatter was overheard by servants and waiters, and the underlings took these revolutionary ideas into the streets in 1948. The chattering society ladies did not participate in any of the ongoing street fighting because they stayed hidden behind their education and their high-minded status, and many of them had been deprived of their estates by the terror of the French Revolution in 1789 and no longer had a place of their own, so they had migrated to Berlin and brought their disturbing insurgent literature and their silly social justice ideas with them. These educated few, squeezed out during the French Terror, had become truly lost because they didn't identify with the revolting class, the miserables, and so they liked to identify with being Marxist proletariats, even though they weren't. In large part, as a response to the Year of Revolutions in 1848, Bismarck made Germany into a strong country in 1871, instead of it being a lot of little kingdoms, and the Austrian Empire had been in place for many centuries when Bismarck united Germany, and within 50 years Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated by Muslims wanting their caliphate instead of a king, and the Russians wanted to defend Serbia from those who had orchestrated the murder of Franz Ferdinand. Because the nobility had failed over the centuries to keep Islamism at bay, the Soviet Revolution certainly would, and Lenin had been raised orthodox and saw communism as a messianic fulfillment, and Lenin came up with his new economic policy to do business with the West while the British landed in Donbass with the White Army to stop him.